So in addition to Belize's commitment in mitigation, Belize's enhanced NDC adds an array of adaptation actions really designed to build critical systems and resilience in sectors such as land use, human settlements, infrastructure, forestry, and biodiversity. The revised NDC really includes focus on new gases such as methane and nitrous oxide. It adds specific implementation timeframes, so looking at key targets for 2025, 2026, 2030 in our commitments. It includes details on costing of mitigation and adaptation actions. So for example, while our total costing for implementation of our NDCs is around $1.9 billion, with the recoverable costs from energy and the waste sector, we're going to see a cost of about $1.24 billion. Belize's updated NDC also includes information on NDC financing, which is very important for us. There's currently investments in developing a climate finance strategy, as well as for us, we're building out a national monitoring, reporting, and verification system. This will really help us to track our targets and achievement. This MRV system, as it's called, will also be accompanied by a 5-year implementation plan so that we can continue to track our achievements and our targets as part of this NDC, which we think is very critical for us. So Belize is proud of a few important elements as part of this new NDC. For instance, our business as usual an NDC scenario for the projections in agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors were conducted based on national data. Therefore, the mitigation targets for this sector were more accurate and they really informed the various priority sectors such as broadleaf forests and mangrove rehabilitation. Secondly, we're proud of the fact that this new updated NDC includes a quantified mitigation targets for agriculture, which we think is significant because it contributes around 63% increase in GHG removals as it relates to the AFOLU sector. As part of this new NDC, Belize is pledging to increase protection of mangroves by more than 12,000 hectares and to rehabilitate more than 4,000 hectares of mangroves by 2030. Really depending on the availability of technical and financial support. Well, the updated NDC included a cross-scale and cross-sector collaborative process that we think really strengthened the 2016 updated NDC. So throughout this process, the NDC update was validated through engagement with a cross-section of technical leads from government, NGOs, and civil society. This ensured that mitigation and adaptation targets were informed by scientific data and that actions were aligned with national policies, strategies, and action plans. The NDC partnership was very important as the NDC partnership and its members play a critical role in the updating of the current NDC. All international entities really work together in coordination with our National Climate Change Office, with support from agencies like IRENA, the Climate Technology Center, Vivid Economics, the UNFCCC's Regional Collaboration Center in Grenada, and among others, to really strengthen the updating process. In the updating of the revised NDC, we wanted a process that was collaborative and that had stakeholder engagement. At the onset, we engaged stakeholders from various sectors, including private sector, civil society, and NGOs, as well as embracing a subsidiary principle that even at the level of communities, we will have participation. From July to September 2020, stakeholders were consulted, taking on a very targeted and collaborative approach. There were focus group sessions of relevant stakeholders on emerging topics such as green buildings, sustainable land reform, and tourism. In addition to Belize's priority in achieving its mitigation target, Belize's focus will be on climate change adaptation. As a member of the Small Island Developing States Group, or a big ocean nation, Belize is exceptionally vulnerable to natural disasters and the impacts of climate change. Our topography as a low-lying coastal nation and our geographical location makes Belize exposed to the risk of rising sea levels and increasing frequency of tropical storms. As such, Belize will seek to build out adaptation in our coastal zone and marine resources to improve sustainable agriculture mechanism, strengthening our fisheries and aquaculture sector, invest in sustainable tourism to support our economy, as well as improve forestry and biodiversity adaptation. Very important for Belize will be to secure financing to improve our adaptation options. For instance, more than $316 million in funding is required to meet our adaptation in mangrove protection and reforestation alone. Furthermore, more than $146 million in funding requirements is needed to meet adaptation in other sectors. As such, Belize is expected to build out its investment and mechanisms for its adaptation framework so as to meet these adaptation targets.
We have three main mandates of the National Climate Change Office, right? First, we're responsible to communicate everything climate change related for the country, coordinate everything climate change related for the country, and of course, it is required for us to mainstream everything that deals with climate change and climate change resiliency, both nationally, regionally, and internationally for the country.
The National Climate Change Office was put together since 2012 as a pro tem office, meaning that it was a temporary office that was just implementing projects at that time.
Among those initiatives is the European Global Climate Change Alliance project, which funded the work of the office. The NCCO, as it is also known, has come a long way since then. In 2015, the creation of the National Climate Change Policy, Strategy and Action Plan gave way for the official establishment of the office within government.
That document guides us on the how-to and what are the steps in order to build our resiliency within those vulnerable sectors. It identifies certain scenarios that the country is going to go through and some of the sectors that are going to be impacted by these scenarios.
So the purpose of the National Climate Change Office is to coordinate the national, regional and international response to climate change on behalf of the government of Belize. In terms of the regional response, we work with our CARICOM partners and we work with our Central American partners to implement mitigation and adaptation activities within the region and also here in Belize. In terms of the national response to climate change, our main aim is to ensure the full implementation of the nationally determined contributions and also the National Climate Change Policy, Strategy and Action Plan.
True to its mission, the NCCO manages a lot of activities, including the development of the country's nationally determined contributions to articulate Belize's contribution to the global effort to address climate change. So, the team provides technical support and advice to civil society groups and public sector departments for the mainstreaming of climate change into their policies, plans, and strategies.
We have signed on to what we call the Paris Agreement. It's an accord that has the participation of nearly 200 countries worldwide. And in that accord, these countries have determined that they will do whatever possible to mitigate climate change or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The emission development strategy is supposed to help us to develop in a climate resilient manner. meaning that we're not only aiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to the impacts of climate change, but we want to ensure that we have socio-economic development.
The National Climate Change Committee guides the overall climate change agenda for the country.
The National Climate Change Office is a secretariat to that committee. It comprises mostly of the priority sectors and senior managers at the CEO level of these priority sectors. Also, to make it a little bit more holistic, they incorporated as well NGO representation, representation from Chamber of Commerce, and also representation from academia. This committee does not work in isolation because there are subcommittees or sub-working groups of this, of the Belize National Climate Change Committee.
These subcommittees, or technical working groups, focus on providing guidance when climate-proofing projects and also when seeking climate finance. An overarching goal of the NCCO is helping you understand just what climate change is and the role that you can play in its mitigation and adaptation. That includes partnering with the Ministry of Education to include climate change awareness into the curriculum.
Climate change studies is unlikely to become a subject by itself, but the issue of climate change is something we have been incorporating into the national curriculum over the past few years. We think that understanding climate in all its different facets and its complexity will help students better understand the specific topic of climate change.
The NCCO continues to partner with various stakeholders to facilitate the implementation of activities which aim to achieve national climate resilience.
A pleasant good afternoon to all our in-person guests and virtual guests. I'm Courtney Weatherburn, your MC. It's such an honor to be here and to welcome you all to the NDC Implementation Plan Launch and Stakeholder Forum. We are live streaming the event on the Government of Belize Press Office Facebook page and YouTube page. So if your colleagues could not be here, you could share the link with them. So firstly, let's all stand for the national anthem.
Arise, ye sons of the
Okay, thank you all so much. You can be seated. So we have an impressive lineup of speakers and panelists that I'm sure we're eager to hear from. So let's get started. Here with the official welcome remarks is CEO in the Ministry of Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management, Dr. Kenrick Williams.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wedderburn, or Mistress of Ceremonies. Good afternoon, everyone, distinguished guests, or Honorable Minister, colleagues at the head table, and of course, our ambassadors. I'm really excited for today's event because of what it reflects. I think as a ministry, we spent a lot of time not just developing the NDC itself and the plan that would guide how Belize reach its target as it relates to its climate change commitments as part of the UNFCCC, but I think that today marks an important event, an important milestone, because we're saying that this is a conversation that has to happen beyond just the public sector, that we need to have discussion as well with the private sector. And so we're very excited that members of the private sector, the Chamber of Commerce, the Central Bank, the other banks in country are part of today's discussion. And so I certainly would like to give a warm welcome to those members of the private sector. As well, our development partners who have been part of this process in developing our NDC, or nationally determined contributions, and now looking to support its implementation in country. As we move forward, therefore, we want to be innovative. We want to be collaborative in our approach to the NDC. We know that Belize is a leader. We know that as a country, we've been exemplary in our conservation commitments. We've been a leader in emission avoidance. And so, as a country now, we want to have the conversation to say, let's look at unique and innovative ways that we can address the issues, the national issues in terms of meeting our NDC commitments, supporting local communities, building our resilience to climate change. And so for the ministry, it was very important that we have this discussion today, a broad-based discussion, a multi-stakeholder discussion that seeks to find a more collaborative and, again, an innovative approach to doing that. We know, all of us in this room, where we stand as a result of COVID, as a result of the many disturbances that we've had. Climate change is one of those disturbances that we have to prepare for. It's more long-term, but we're going to see the variations. And so as a country, as multiple stakeholders, we're going to have to, again, be innovative in our approach to do that. So I have the pleasure of welcoming you today to this discussion. I certainly look forward to the discussion with the panel, and thereafter, once we're done with the formalities, to have some other discussions, to collaborate, to discuss amongst ourselves, amongst partners across the room, in ways that we can get involved. The important thing here today is how, particularly what I define as the non-traditional sectors and the non-traditional actors, we would like to see you be part of the conversation. And that is what this avenue is for today. So with that, I'm happy to welcome you, and we look forward to the event this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, CEO Williams. Indeed, we encourage everyone to be engaged in the panel discussion. And of course, after the event, there's a mixer, and you get the best of both worlds. You get to continue the conversation and, of course, enjoy a selection of scrumptious hors d'oeuvres. Next up, we have a recorded statement by the Global Director for the NDC Partnership Support Unit, Dr. Pablo Vieira, stationed in Washington, D.C. Let's hear his remarks.
Honorable Minister of State of the Ministry of Finance, Economic Development and Investment, Mr. Christopher Cui. Honorable Minister of Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management, Mr. Orlando Habet. Honorable CEO of the Ministry of Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management, Dr. Kendrick Williams, esteemed government and international development partners representatives, distinguished moderator and panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the NDC Partnership, allow me to start by thanking and congratulating the government of Belize. Your leadership and commitment to addressing climate change while building resilience and adapting to climate impacts have been inspirational. Belize's revised Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC, submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is a clear sign of this commitment. In addition to being a carbon sink, Belize has committed to enhancing its climate ambition compared to the previous NDC, increasing by 63% the removals of greenhouse gases in the AFOLU sector and expanding to 75% the share of renewable energy in electricity generation. We commend the government on expanding sectoral targets and adding an array of adaptation actions designed to build critical systems and resilience in sectors such as land use, human settlements, infrastructure, forestry, and biodiversity. Moreover, it is essential to note that Belize's commitment are backed by a concrete NDC implementation plan that outlines sector priorities and a clear result-based framework for planning, coordinating, tracking, and mobilizing resources for climate action. The NDC and its implementation plan were made possible due to the strong government leadership and a whole-of-society effort firmly grounded on sectoral plans and priorities. More than 10 ministries and 80 stakeholders participated in the process, showing a clear determination and a whole-of-society approach to climate action. We are proud to be part of the process through the NDC Partnership Climate Action Enhancement Package, or CAP. Under the leadership of Belize, CAP has mobilized and coordinated the support from more than 9 partners that assisted the country in elaborating its NDC, the NDC Implementation Plan, and the Climate Finance Strategy. From the early stages, the government showed a clear sign of ownership and readiness, setting the momentum that is fundamental to face the challenges and opportunities to promote sustainable, low-carbon, and resilient development. We would like to use this opportunity to express our gratitude to the NDC Partnership members that assisted Belize in the definition of its NDC implementation plan. Recognizing the leadership of the government of Belize, more than 15 NDC Partnership members and implementing partners are providing technical and financial support to advance the implementation of the country's NDC. I want to recognize your efforts and thank you for your support. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank our focal point, Dr. Lennox Gladden, Chief Climate Change Officer in the National Climate Change Office, for the guidance and leadership throughout this entire process, and the NDC Partnership in-country facilitator, Ms. Gina Young, for her commitment and tireless effort in assisting in the revision of the NDC and elaboration of the new NDC implementation plan. The diversity of stakeholders involved in this plan and the high-level political momentum here today is a testimony of the commitment and ownership that are needed to foster collective action for greater impact. What is happening in Belize through this process is precisely what the NDC Partnership is all about. The country clearly articulates their commitments and support needs, backed up with national policies and strategies. Through this structure, the development community delivers coordinated actions and support, leading to effective implementation of the NDC through a coordinated and transparent whole-of-society approach. A lot has been achieved to set the groundwork for ambitious climate action in Belize. However, most of the hard work is still ahead as we move towards implementing the national climate and development priorities. In this room, physical and virtual, we have high-level representatives, government officials, development partners, and representatives from the private sector, civil society organizations, and academia. This collective is now a team working together to address climate change in Belize. We look forward to continuing this journey with the government of Belize and the development community that has rallied behind the process to advance the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Congratulations and thank you very much.
A special thank you to Dr. Vieira for his remarks. It sets the foundation for our next speaker delivering the opening remarks, CEO responsible for economic development in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Development and Investment, Dr. Osman Martinez. Dr. Martinez is deputizing for the Minister of State, Honorable Christopher Koyi. Welcome, Dr. Martinez.
Thank you. It is an honor to be here today with you all, and please receive warm greetings from the Honorable Minister Koyi. Unfortunately, he was not able to make it here. Allow me to greet the Honorable Minister Habet, CEOs. Well, I say CEOs because I have several of my colleagues here. I see CEO Leal, Sabido, Chal, Tapia, and if I miss anyone, please accept my apologies. Also, I see some friends and partners from the UN agencies, the European Union, Aniceto and Xavier, the Taiwanese embassy, our good friends, some colleagues from the government. All the way to the back, earlier I met the governor of Central Bank. I think he needs to come a little bit to the front here, my friend. Also the president of the University of Belize, and everyone that is here, pleasant good afternoon. If I miss you, I will definitely give you my greetings, like the executive director of 5Cs. I will give him a special greeting later. Today we are here, and the first thing that comes to my mind is, where are we going with the NDCs? And this is a good example of moving from a traditional economic system to a modern economic system, whereby we need to start to decarbonize certain sectors of our ecosystem. Decarbonize the transport sector, decarbonize the agriculture sector, even the aviation sector. You know, I was amazed that I was flying in one of the airlines, and I learned that they are also using renewable fuel to fly. And that is the direction that we are going. But why Belize, when Belize contribution of CO2 is so small, why is it important to Belize? Why? Because Belize ranks number 8 among the countries in the world that are most vulnerable to climate change. And the impact that it has is not only on the purse of government, but also on the private sector. When I look at the data between 2010 and 2020, the government of Belize every year loses about, or spends because of the impacts and the damages of climate change, around $45 million US, which is 90 million Belize dollars. But what about the private sector? The private sector is losing in capital assets around 400 million per year. So the damage that climate change and the impact that it has in both public and private pores is very high. Hence the reason the updated NDC implementation plan to be presented here today also emphasizes the importance of accessing climate finance. We cannot continue to be a carbon sink for the industrial countries. As a proactive measure, the government of Belize established a new climate finance unit within the Ministry of Economic Development, who I'm happy to have the director of that unit here, Mr. Carlos Paul, and whose mandate is to maximize Belize's access to climate finance and translate our climate change goals into implementable, finance-ready projects. A vital funding source that falls within the mandate of the Climate Finance Unit is the Green Climate Fund, GCF. and soon the Adaptation Fund. Belize has an updated strategic framework that includes a country program for engagement with the GCF. This country program fits within the context of our NDCs and all other national strategies and priorities that directly address climate change and the sectors especially vulnerable to climate change impact. This means that all projects, proposals that we submit to the GCF must also show a clear link to Belize's NDCs. So if the private sector wants to take advantage of this, you're welcome, but we must have a direct link with the NDCs. The implementation plan presented here today outlines a feasibility way to achieve Belize's updated NDCs targets through meaningful stakeholder engagement, government partnerships, and a streamlined process for coordination and tracking of climate change projects. On behalf of the Ministry of Economic Development, I pledge our commitment to carrying out this implementation plan, as well as the actionable items outlined in the document that will ensure Belize is on the right track to build our climate resilience. I encourage your participation in today's forum, not only as representatives from your respective organization, but as engaged citizens of Belize. I look forward to the presentation of the NDC implementation plan and anticipate a fruitful discussion during this forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez, for the opening remarks. We now call on the Minister of Sustainable Development, Climate Change, and Disaster Risk Management, Honorable Orlando Habet, to deliver the keynote address. Join me in welcoming Minister Habet.
Thank you very much, Ms. Courtney. Good afternoon, everyone. Your Excellency, Ambassador to the Embassy of the Republic of China, Taiwan, David Kwan Chua Chien, Your Excellency, Deputy British High Commissioner Kate Reynolds, Dr. Osmond Martinez, and other government representatives, CEOs, certainly those from the Ministry of Sustainable Development, Climate Change, and Disaster Risk Management, Dr. Pablo Vieira. I know I met you, and I thank you for meeting with CEO and myself in Glasgow and again in Costa Rica. Dr. Colin Young, Ms. Diane Wade, Mr. Barcelo Blake, Mr. Christopher McGann, CEO Williams, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here with us today. It is a great pleasure to be here today speaking on behalf of the Ministry of Sustainable Development, Climate Change, and Disaster Risk Management, and to participate in the official launch of the Nationally Determined Contribution Implementation Plan. As we all know, small island developing states such as Belize are at the front line of the fight against climate change. As such, we must strive to continue collaboration efforts and to support each other to continue learning and implementing actions to increase our adaptive capacity and decrease greenhouse gas emissions. NDCs are at the heart of the Paris Agreement and are crucial to the individual and collective long-term goal of limiting global warming. NDCs ensure countries contribute their part in limiting global temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels. They are robust national climate plans, which highlight climate actions, including ambitious climate-related targets, policies, and measures that governments aim to implement in response to climate change and as a contribution to the global fight against climate change. These plans are nationally determined. Of course, This requires an implementation plan which is just as robust and most certainly required the continued support of the NDC partnership, with contributions both already mapped out during the elaboration of the plan and also with new interventions from our development partners. Ladies and gentlemen, Belize faces many challenges ahead. Due to our geographic location, low-lying coastal areas, and high dependence on our natural resources, we are at risk to the impacts of climate change, with limited capacity to adapt to the imminent changes. As a nation, Belize has already experienced many effects due to climate change, such as drought, flooding, change in precipitation and temperature patterns, coastal erosion, coral bleaching, and many others. The country is also seasonally affected by tropical storms and hurricanes, which are projected to become more intense each year due to the effects of human-induced global warming and higher sea surface temperatures. Amidst all these challenges, Belize has continued to be committed in the fight against climate change and ventured into updating its NDC with higher ambition, complemented by a climate finance strategy and an NDC implementation plan. Through implementation of the NDC, Belize is estimated to avoid total cumulative emissions across all sectors of 5,647 kilotons of carbon dioxide equivalent between 2021 and 2030, with raised overall mitigation ambition by 5%. We aim to achieve 75% of renewable energy in electricity generation by 2030. In the coastal zone and marine resources sector, we will increase resilience by assessing coral restoration potential and developing an early warning system to monitor and detect unhealthy areas of the reef. In agriculture, we are looking to the improvement of crop and livestock husbandry practices, which also include agroforestry and silvopastoral systems, while increasing access to drought-tolerant crops and livestock breeds, as well as adopting better soil and water management practices. The tourism sector, adaptive capacity, will be increased by assessing coastal tourism areas that are vulnerable to climate change and identifying their carrying capacities. These are only a small fraction of our ambitious targets. I must note that we could not have gotten here today without the support and collaboration of all our partners and national stakeholders that were involved in the process of updating the NDCs. This was a stakeholder-driven process which included government, NGOs, the private sector, academia, and research institutions. It is truly a great feat. I would like to thank the NDC partnership and all other partners standing with us and supporting us to enhance our climate ambition and implement climate action. Belize looks forward to collaborating with all partners for NDC implementation up to 2025, on to 2030 and beyond. Finance and implementation are imperative facets in achieving Belize's ambitious NDC targets. SIDS economies have already stretched to an unimaginable level due to climate change and have been amplified by the impacts of the pandemic. International climate finance and support is, therefore, imperative for Belize, like for all other small island developing states, to implement our ambitious climate action. Ladies and gentlemen, we must also note that in order to effectively implement our climate commitments, the threat of climate change requires multi-sectoral action at the national level for policymakers, technical experts, academia, the private sector, and the public in order to seek solutions and make changes to enhance our resilience and low-carbon transition. I would like to encourage everyone to draw on the technical expertise of each other and to take ambitious action to tackle climate change and continue working with the government of Belize. We look forward to this great effort to working with our partners and national stakeholders in addressing climate change. I would like to end with a quote by the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, which says, "We are the first generation to be able to end poverty and the last generation that can take steps to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Future generations will judge us harshly if we fail to uphold our moral and historical responsibilities." I thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for that keynote address. We move on to a presentation by the Chief Climate Change Officer at the National Climate Change Office, Dr. Lennox Gladden. Dr. Gladden will be delivering an overview of the NDC implementation plan. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Gladden.
Yes. Good evening, colleagues, excellencies. It's always a challenge, going after the CEO and the Minister and Dr. Martinez. I think they have summarized everything that I was trying to present. Nevertheless, I will be focusing on the implementation plan. But before looking at the implementation plan, we need to take a step back and take a gander of the updated NDC itself. So, as it relates to Belize's updated NDC, we submitted it September of last year. What I consider exceptional about the updated NDC, it is the manner in which it was conducted. It was a very collaborative, as Minister and CEO alluded to. It was very robust, ambitious, but taking all of this into consideration, it was a very realistic national determined contribution, right? So it encapsulated 11 sectors. Of these 11 sectors, given our vulnerability, we focus not only on mitigation, but on adaptation as well. But for the NDC and also for the climate finance strategy that we rolled out earlier this year, for it to function, for it to be operationalized, implementation plan needed to be developed. Right? So here we have the national determined contribution, which is of course our commitment to the Paris Agreement or on the overall climate change agenda. So looking at the NDC implementation plan, and of course the updated NDC, what was, and I stated earlier, why was it so robust? We had engagement and considerable engagement from the private sector, local indigenous communities, and civil society. This was not done in the previous NDC, right? And it was something that even some of our partners under the partnership itself, they applauded us for this effort. Mind you, it took a little longer to actually accomplish this, but it was a meaningful delay because it comes back down to taking everybody's input into consideration. For the most part, we all know what are our challenges within our respective sectors, right? Doing this co-creative approach, this shared value approach, we were able to update our NDC and take into consideration, of course, that while we have the implementation plan, it needed to be coupled with a climate finance strategy. And the importance of this implementation plan is for us to be a little bit more accountable, right? Not only to our respective sectors, but also to the international community, right? Accountable, transparent, and to demonstrate that we are indeed being more ambitious in our overall or national climate change agenda. Next slide, please. So the implementation plan itself is a tool ingrained in what we can consider a quantifiable approach because it takes into consideration a results-based framework. Right? So climate change in itself, when you want to adapt, when you want to mitigate, it's a science-driven process, it's an engineering-driven process. We need for it to be quantifiable. Qualitative data is not sufficient to make certain decisions. Taking this into consideration, the whole idea behind the implementation plan, it being the tool, the driving platform between in making good on our targets, on our actions which feed into our targets, it aims in, of course, it's a plan, so it helps with planning, overall coordination, progress tracking, because at the end of the day, when we want to take stock of what we have achieved and what we hope to achieve as a country, we need to be able to take stock and we need to be able to track all of our activities on the ground. And of course, it assists with resource mobilization. Next slide, please. So the plan itself can be separated into two categories. It looks at the request, and as I mentioned before, it is a very data-driven process, and on the other side, the response. How it works, and through the NDC partnership, we have our targets within our NDC. We have certain actions that we need to do in order to achieve those targets. Right? Going back to the importance of data, and this was something that was also highlighted in a recent assessment as it relates to the small businesses. All right? They agree that when one of the areas that they find quite challenging is getting the data in order, aggregated data, right, to make some of these decisions, even for project formulation, right? So that is one of the challenges that was highlighted. But going back to the request portion, how it works, within the implementation plan, the various sectors, the various activities, they have a cost to it. So we put out the request, we have certain indicators within the implementation plan, and our partners in development, right, our bilateral partners as well, they then look at how they can then help us to make good on these activities in order to achieve our overall climate change goal for the if you're looking at the targets within the specific sectors. So this is how it is structured within the implementation plan itself. When we look at the genesis of the implementation plan, originally it was structured in this format. Right? So this is just a quick example looking at the energy sector, of course. Right? It has the output, it has the performance indicator. Like I said, we need to measure. It's always a challenge to manage something that you've never measured before. And who are some of the implementing agencies or institutions? What is the baseline, right? So after these things have been established, how does it contribute to not only the national determined contributions, but during our policy landscape exercise, we realized that a lot of organizations, they have strategies, they have certain doctrines that speak to building resilience. It's not necessarily under the name climate change, but it speaks to resiliency building. Right? So how is that aligned? And of course, by and large, how does that now contribute to our national determined contribution? So the implementation plan, like I said, the genesis, if you want to consider version, the draft version 1.0, this is how it looked like, right? But we understand in itself, this is not palatable, right? It's difficult to access. So we transition, right, through the help of the partnership. This, again, going back, that was part A that looked at the first section, and then the response. Of course, it says where the funding source, and this ties into resource mobilization. How do we actually get the resources, both technical and financial, right, to make good on the targets that we highlighted as priority within our national determined contributions, right? And the costing, I know it wasn't mentioned earlier. The next slide shows the costing of Belize's national determined contributions by sector. So this is just to highlight that as a country, we cannot, government itself, state actors themselves, we cannot bear the overall costs to actually implement Belize's national determined contributions. We require to build that strong collaboration between private sector entities, but this cannot be done if the enabling environment is not created. Right? Next slide, please. So, looking at the transition, as I mentioned, how is it actually structured? The tool itself, it aims to have that seamless transition when it comes to collaboration and tracking the actions under the agenda. So we see that from the architecture, right, this is how we interface. As I presented earlier, it was in a simple worksheet, but again, this is a part of it's not practical, right? We have graduated to making phone calls to check on each sectors, you know. So how are you doing as it relates to your national determined contributions to where we are now as it relates to monitoring and reporting, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so this is live now. So it is online, and it helps manage access, of course. It highlights, again, the baseline, the respective sectors, and all of this helps to build that relationship, because like we have as a country, have access to it. This is under the NDC partnership. This is our profile. This is Belize's profile, right? It has the dashboard option. So again, it makes for seamless communication, and it helps with tracking climate finance flows. So from the platform, these are some of the reports, visual things that you can take into consideration, whereby looking at finance flows is important to track from which donor certain support is coming from by sector. So it has that functionality as well. Of course, with the intent of being more transparent, more accountable, not only to ourselves, but to our partners who have walked this journey with us to build up on our climate change agenda. Again, we look at other options. This is just a brief summary of when entering into the platform, what are some of the functions of the platform. Because historically, it has been a problem to hold ourselves accountable when it comes to certain initiatives, right? Tracking our NDCs and even looking into the future as it relates to our LEDs. Next slide, please. Okay, so as it relates to the user interface, this is managed access because, again, in the back end, we have partners, right? We have the Commonwealth. We also have the Umbrella Group. We have the World Bank Group. We have IDB, right? We have Rocky Mountain Institute. All of our partners, they will have access to the platform, and it is going to be circulated on I think a quarterly level, on a quarterly period. So in the event it is not within their programming cycle within the next 3 months, then maybe within the next 6 months, an activity within our NDC might pop up, and then they will say, listen, we can provide support for this activity. It might not be within this quarter, but maybe for the next quarter. Right? So it helps with coordination and planning, because last thing we want to end up in a situation whereby we end up duplicating efforts and not maximizing the resources that are available to us. So looking at the tail end of the presentation, again, we as an office, as a ministry, and as a government, we appreciate the support that was given to us by the NDC partnership and all the entities, institutions, governments listed here. As I mentioned before, it was quite a lengthy but meaningful process, and it just shows that in building our ambition, in making Belize a little bit more resilient, as a country, we're not alone, and we have development partners, countries that are willing to help us to raise our ambition and have Belize continue being at that next tier when it comes to climate change ambition. So with that, I conclude my presentation and I pass it back to Ms. Courtney. Thank you again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Gladden, for that overview. So now we'll take a break. We have concluded or come to the conclusion of the first segment of the program. We have a 10-minute break. You guys can grab a snack, stretch, mingle, but don't get too comfortable because when we come back, we'll have the first of 2 panel discussions. Also, if you didn't have a chance to catch it, we will be playing Belize's NDC Spotlight video, which highlights the features of the updated NDC and the updating process itself. Enjoy.
So in addition to Belize's commitment in mitigation, Belize's enhanced NDC adds an array of adaptation actions really designed to build critical systems and resilience in sectors such as land use, human settlements, infrastructure, forestry, and biodiversity. The revised NDC really includes focus on new gases such as methane and nitrous oxide. It adds specific implementation timeframes, so looking at key targets for 2025, 2026, 2030 in our commitments. It includes details on costing of mitigation and adaptation actions. So for example, while our total costing for implementation of our NDCs is around $1.9 billion, with the recoverable costs from energy and the waste sector, we're going to see a cost of about $1.24 billion. Belize's updated NDC also includes information on NDC financing, which is very important for us. There's currently investments in developing a climate finance strategy, As well as for us, we're building out a national monitoring, reporting, and verification system. This will really help us to track our targets and achievement. This MRV system, as it's called, will also be accompanied by a 5-year implementation plan so that we can continue to track our achievements and our targets as part of this NDC, which we think is very critical for us. So Belize is proud of a few important elements as part of this new NDC. For instance, our business as usual an NDC scenario for the projections in agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors were conducted based on national data. Therefore, the mitigation targets for this sector were more accurate and they really informed the various priority sectors such as broadleaf forests and mangrove rehabilitation. Secondly, we're proud of the fact that this new updated NDC includes a quantified mitigation targets for agriculture, which we think is significant because it contributes around 63% increase in GHG removals as it relates to the AFOLU sector. As part of this new NDC, Belize is pledging to increase protection of mangroves by more than 12,000 hectares and to rehabilitate more than 4,000 hectares of mangroves by 2030, really depending on the availability of technical and financial support. Well, the updated NDC included a cross-scale and cross-sector collaborative process that we think really strengthened the 2016 updated NDC. So throughout this process, the NDC update was validated through engagement with a cross-section of technical leads from government, NGOs, and civil society. This ensured that mitigation and adaptation targets were informed by scientific data and that actions were aligned with national policies, strategies, and action plans. The NDC partnership was very important as the NDC partnership and its members play a critical role in the updating of the current NDC. All international entities really work together in coordination with our National Climate Change Office, with support from agencies like IRENA, the Climate Technology Center, Vivid Economics, the UNFCCC's Regional Collaboration Center in Grenada, and among others, to really strengthen the updating process. In the updating of the revised NDC, we wanted a process that was collaborative and that had stakeholder engagement. At the onset, we engaged stakeholders from various sectors, including private sector, civil society, and NGOs, as well as embracing a subsidiary principle that even at the level of communities, we will have participation. From July to September 2020, stakeholders were consulted, taking on a very targeted and collaborative approach. There were focus group sessions of relevant stakeholders on emerging topics such as green buildings, sustainable land reform, and tourism. In addition to Belize's priority in achieving its mitigation target, Belize's focus will be on climate change adaptation. As a member of the Small Island Developing States Group, or a big ocean nation, Belize is exceptionally vulnerable to natural disasters and the impacts of climate change. Our topography as a low-lying coastal nation and our geographical location makes Belize exposed to the risk of rising sea levels and increasing frequency of tropical storms. As such, Belize will seek to build out adaptation in our coastal zone and marine resources to improve sustainable agriculture mechanism, strengthening our fisheries and aquaculture sector, invest in sustainable tourism to support our economy, as well as improve forestry and biodiversity adaptation. Very important for Belize will be to secure financing to improve our adaptation options. For instance, more than 316 million US dollars in funding is required to meet our adaptation in mangrove protection and reforestation alone. Furthermore, more than $146 million in funding requirements is needed to meet adaptation in other sectors. As such, Belize is expected to build out its investment and mechanisms for its adaptation framework so as to meet these adaptation targets.
Mangroves are a natural resource that are protected under the laws of Belize since 1989. 4 species of mangroves, the black, the white, the red, and the buttonwood, cover 3.4% of Belize's land surface. This type of water forest ecosystem acts as home for juvenile marine life, helps to prevent coastal erosion, and stores large amounts of carbon for long periods. Their protection reduces greenhouse gas emissions and supports climate change mitigation.
If climate change and some of the impacts of climate change, it impacts the forest, right? Then it has a ripple effect. So in turn, by not combating or not showing a level of sustainable forest management, right, in effect it can exacerbate the impacts of climate change, right, and expedite some of the impacts that we're seeing as a result of climate change. If you want to produce in a certain area, you have to go through a level of destruction of that ecosystem, right? Deforestation that disrupts the watershed. Again, an imbalance. You might not see the impacts now, right? But it's all connected.
But this important ecosystem is sometimes taken for granted. It's among one of the first to be cleared and discarded by developers along coastline communities, rivers, estuaries, and on the Keys, and is affected by deforestation.
We don't know if there's been any environmental impact assessment done by the people who are cutting down the mangrove patches here. And if you notice along the street as well, the street was washing away, and so we decided as a community to come together to plant back mangroves along the street. And so we are very, very concerned about the impacts of what this type of development can have on our community.
Todo esto era manglar. Aquí era un santuario de aves. Todo era manglar natural. Ahora todo se fue.
And Burgers Key, as much of Belize's Caribbean coast, is home to mangroves. A few residents have taken it upon themselves to raise awareness about the importance of mangroves. Some stakeholders have opted to coexist with these amazing trees instead of cutting them down.
That I would encourage everyone who's thinking about investing or creating something. I think they should work with the mangroves, work around it. There's many ways of working around it without taking it down completely. And anything green should be protected. We should protect, whether in the islands or wherever, we should be very careful with it and use it to our advantage, knowing now the importance of the mangroves and the role it plays for everybody, for the way we live, for our kids, our families, and especially the marine life. The importance of it is immense.
To conserve mangrove, other residents trim and manicure them into a landscape. Islander Calvin Young looks after a patch of mangrove forest within downtown San Pedro. It has become an iguana sanctuary.
This is Eco Iguana Corner Foundation. We've been in existence now for 14 years, but we've just been recognized by the government for 4 years now. Most people see the mangrove and they see it as a trash pile. They try everything they don't want in their yard. They try to throw it over in the trash, and it makes no sense. So it's like, I know, if you care about where you live, the first thing you want to try to do is clean up where you live. You see how the temperature difference is here? Way different, cooler. That's one benefit. When it comes to erosion, that's a plus. I mean, you know, a lot of things that we have that we take for granted was because of the mangrove. We into the preservation and the awareness of the iguana being extinct.
I think awareness is really important. You know, education is really important, because if everyone can understand what climate change is, what is causing climate change, and how we can mitigate climate change, then that is, I believe, a way how we can help to mitigate the effects of climate change and for all of us to be part of the solution. So I think education is really important, and that's the reason why we're out in the communities to do a lot of awareness sessions, to educate our people, you know, what is really causing it and how we can be part of the solution.
This blue carbon ecosystem is key to the survival of the fishing industry, tourism, and helps in the mitigation of climate change. And all stakeholders from the policy level to grassroots must continue to work together to conserve and protect this natural resource.
Let us, you know, use our resources sustainably, because at the end of the day, it's for our benefit and also for, you know, our future, because we all depend on forests.
We have three main mandates of the National Climate Change Office, right? First, we're responsible to communicate everything climate change related for the country, coordinate everything climate change related for the country, and of course, it is required for us to mainstream everything that deals with climate change and climate change resiliency, both nationally, regionally, and internationally for the country.
The National Climate Change Office was put together since 2012 as a pro-tem office, meaning that it was a temporary office that was just implementing projects at that time.
Among those initiatives is the European Global Climate Change Alliance project, which funded the work of the office. The NCCO, as it is also known, has come a long way since then. In 2015, the creation of the National Climate Change Policy, Strategy and Action Plan gave way for the official establishment of the office within government.
That document guides us on the how-to and what are the steps in order to build our resiliency within those vulnerable sectors. It identifies certain scenarios that the country is going to go through and some of the sectors that are going to be impacted by these scenarios.
So the purpose of the National Climate Change Office is to coordinate the national, regional, and international response to climate change on behalf of the government of Belize. In terms of the regional response, we work with our CARICOM partners and we work with our Central American partners to implement mitigation and adaptation activities within the region and also here in Belize. In terms of the national response to climate change, our main aim is to ensure the full implementation of the nationally determined contributions and also the National Climate Change Policy, Strategy and Action Plan.
True to its mission, the NCCO manages a lot of activities, including the development of the country's nationally determined contributions to articulate Belize's contribution to the global effort to address climate change. So, the team provides technical support and advice to civil society groups and public sector departments for the mainstreaming of climate change into their policies, plans, and strategies.
We have signed on to what we call the Paris Agreement. It's an accord that has the participation of nearly 200 countries worldwide. And in that accord, these countries have determined that they will do whatever possible to mitigate climate change or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Low emission development strategy is supposed to help us to develop in a climate resilient manner, meaning that we're not only aiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to the impacts of climate change, but we want to ensure that we have socio-economic development.
The National Climate Change Committee guides the overall climate change agenda for the country.
The National Climate Change Office is a secretariat to that committee. It comprises mostly of the priority sectors and senior managers at the CEO level of these priority sectors. Also, to make it a little bit more holistic, they incorporated as well NGO representation, representation from Chamber of Commerce, and also representation from academia. This committee does not work in isolation because there are subcommittees or sub-working groups of this, of the Belize National Climate Change Committee.
These subcommittees, or technical working groups, focus on providing guidance when climate-proofing projects and also when seeking climate finance. An overarching goal of the NCCO is helping you understand just what climate change is and the role that you can play in its mitigation and adaptation. That includes partnering with the Ministry of Education to include climate change awareness into the curriculum.
Climate change studies is unlikely to become a subject by itself, but the issue of climate change is something we have been incorporating into the national curriculum over the past few years. We think that understanding climate in all its different facets and its complexity will help students better understand the specific topic of climate change.
The NCCO continues to partner with various stakeholders to facilitate the implementation of activities which aim to achieve national climate resilience.
So in addition to Belize's commitment in mitigation, Belize's enhanced NDC adds an array of adaptation actions really designed to build critical systems and resilience in sectors such as land use, human settlements, infrastructure, forestry, and biodiversity. The revised NDC really includes focus on new gases such as methane and nitrous oxide. It adds specific implementation timeframes, so looking at key targets for 2025, 2026, 2030 in our commitments. It includes details on costing of mitigation and adaptation actions. So for example, while our total costing for implementation of our NDCs is around $1.9 billion, with the recoverable costs from energy and the waste sector, we're going to see a cost of about $1.24 billion. Belize's updated NDC also includes information on NDC financing, which is very important for us. There's currently investments in developing a climate finance strategy, as well as for us, we're building out a national monitoring, reporting, and verification system. This will really help us to track our targets and achievement. This MRV system, as it's called, will also be accompanied by a 5-year implementation plan so that we can continue to track our achievements and our targets as part of this NDC, which we think is very critical for us. So Belize is proud of a few important elements as part of this new NDC. For instance, our business as usual an NDC scenario for the projections in agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors were conducted based on national data. Therefore, the mitigation targets for this sector were more accurate and they really informed the various priority sectors such as broadleaf forests and mangrove rehabilitation. Secondly, we're proud of the fact that this new updated NDC includes a quantified mitigation targets for agriculture, which we think is significant because it contributes around 63% increase in GHG removals as it relates to the AFOLU sector. As part of this new NDC, Belize is pledging to increase protection of mangroves by more than 12,000 hectares and to rehabilitate more than 4,000 hectares of mangroves by 2030. Really depending on the availability of technical and financial support. Well, the updated NDC included a cross-scale and cross-sector collaborative process that we think really strengthened the 2016 updated NDC. So throughout this process, the NDC update was validated through engagement with a cross-section of technical leads from government, NGOs, and civil society. This ensured that mitigation and adaptation targets were informed by scientific data, and that actions were aligned with national policies, strategies, and action plans. The NDC partnership was very important, as the NDC partnership and its members play a critical role in the updating of the current NDC. All international entities really work together in coordination with our National Climate Change Office, with support from agencies like IRENA, the Climate Technology Center, Vivid Economics, the UNFCCC's Regional Collaboration Center in Grenada, and among others, to really strengthen the updating process. In the updating of the revised NDC, we wanted a process that was collaborative and that had stakeholder engagement. At the onset, we engaged stakeholders from various sectors, including private sector, civil society, and NGOs, as well as embracing a subsidiary principle that even at the level of communities, we will have participation. From July to September 2020, stakeholders were consulted, taking on a very targeted and collaborative approach. There were focus group sessions of relevant stakeholders on emerging topics such as green buildings, sustainable land reform, and tourism. In addition to Belize's priority in achieving its mitigation target, Belize's focus will be on climate change adaptation. As a member of the Small Island Developing States Group, or a big ocean nation, Belize is exceptionally vulnerable to natural disasters and the impacts of climate change. Our topography as a low-lying coastal nation and our geographical location makes Belize exposed to the risk of rising sea levels and increasing frequency of tropical storms. As such, Belize will seek to build out adaptation in our coastal zone and marine resources to improve sustainable agriculture mechanism, strengthening our fisheries and aquaculture sector, invest in sustainable tourism to support our economy, as well as improve forestry and biodiversity adaptation. Very important for Belize will be to secure financing to improve our adaptation options. For instance, more than $316 million in funding is required to meet our adaptation in mangrove protection and reforestation alone. Furthermore, more than $146 million in funding requirements is needed to meet adaptation in other sectors. As such, Belize is expected to build out its investment and mechanisms for its adaptation framework so as to meet these adaptation targets.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We'll delve right into the first of two panel discussions. The first topic is meeting NDC objectives in non-traditional sectors, experiences in Belize and the Caribbean. Our distinguished panelists include Minister of Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management, Honorable Orlando Habet, Chief Climate Change Officer in the National Climate Change Office, Dr. Lennox Gladden, Executive Director at the Caribbean Climate Change Community Center, Dr. Colin Young, and Senior Program Analyst at the United Nations Development Program, Ms. Diane Wade. Please join me in welcoming CEO Dr. Kenrick Williams, who will be moderating both discussions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mistress of Ceremony. As we started the discussion earlier, or some of the speeches and or presentation really tried to paint the picture of, what is Belize's focus or core areas or core sectors in terms of NDC and the plan that we've outlined in terms of implementation. In my intervention this morning, I said, for the ministry and for the government, we want to have a discussion that is broad-based. We want to incorporate multiple stakeholders, multiple sectors in this discussion. What we want to do in the second segment this afternoon is to have two sets of discussion. The first with this panel that would look at what I term, what we've coined as non-traditional sectors. Largely within the climate change discussion, you would have your traditional sectors, energy, transport, of course, our Ministry of Climate Change. But quite often, there are opportunities within other sectors, within infrastructure, within housing, within health, that we don't look at and we don't discuss. So to kick off the discussion, we have a distinguished panel here that would opine a bit on some of the opportunities that exist, some of the experiences in NDC implementation and meeting the objectives of the NDC in non-traditional sectors. Minister, I first start with you. Can you opine for us a bit on why is it important for us to look at these non-traditional sectors and non-traditional actors and incorporate them into the discussion and considerations for NDC implementation?
Okay, good afternoon once again. I think the non-traditional sectors in all the sectors of the economy are absolutely important. We have seen how some of these have really come up because of what has happened in the primary sectors, which were the traditional sectors, whether it's in agriculture where you have sugar, bananas, and then the tourism sector and everything else. But I think that it's what has happened from these primary sectors that have branched off, the manufacturing, the agro-processing, and to me, in general, I think is looking at efficiency. So if you're looking at energy, for example, how can you reduce the energy consumption, which right now possibly may be still being used, using some petroleum for production of energy, but also how that particular industry can become efficient. Let's say you have a meat processing plant, which now you have left the traditional one, which is the production of livestock, but now you have come into your processing, and which is now non-traditional, but you have high cost of production. A lot of it comes from energy, but now you can go solar. If in the milk industry, the milk has to be heated up to a certain temperature during pasteurization, do you just dump that hot water that was used within those vats to heat up the milk, or do you take that same heat to start warming up the cool milk that's coming from one section, so that then you can, when you really want to heat it up to pasteurization temperature, you already use some of the heat that was produced from the prior sector. I think that also what we have to look at is those sectoral linkages. We have the forestry sector, and we have some of those traditional ones, maybe even non-traditional, because we can even consider corn production traditional, or in some areas non-traditional, depending on what you use it for. But you're starting to look at the production of corn for other things, like for oil and biofuels. And you have, from the forest, you're starting to get all this top quality cacao, which is now for export. And you can also pin onto it how it is produced in a protected area by indigenous people. 30% women are producers. And then you see that there is a lot of many areas that you can tap into, and you start really putting into that implementation plan for the NDCs. You mentioned the area of housing and infrastructure. Well, if government now has plans to build some homes, but also the public sector who have people who do their subdivisions and start building homes, how can we start reducing the energy used there by building the homes appropriately, so that they're insulated either from for us, not from the cold, but from the heat, but then you can conserve energy. The use of bulbs, we used to use incandescent bulbs. We went to fluorescent bulbs. Can we now transition into LEDs that will consume 70% less of energy? So I think that also, if we look at what happened to us during these 2 years of COVID, you have all our young people who came out of school, couldn't find a job, but became young entrepreneurs and started working from home. And so how is it that we can incorporate them into the entire plan so that they might not go back to work, or maybe even some of our public officers or from the private sector that have now stayed at home and worked from home? How can you reduce some of those emissions from maybe using light, the refrigerator every day and everything else? But also, when you start looking at how you can do a lot of recycling and the areas of land use. I recall a meeting we went to with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And this is where some of the industrialized countries have to realize what they are doing to us sometimes. For example, we export bananas from the south. And maybe 20–25% of our bananas are not exported because of, not of quality, but because of the banana is too small or it's too large. But when it reaches in Europe, the banana is sold by the kilo. It's not by the banana. And so if we are going to deforest 100,000 acres to produce the so many million pounds of bananas that we sell, possibly we only needed 75,000 acres to produce that same banana, because the entire 100% would be exported. And things like that we have to start looking at.
Yeah, I think that's really looking at some of the key sectors, agriculture, and not just looking at the product, but looking at value chain, additionality, and looking at a full scope of the various sectors. I think you also mentioned about the service industry and even bringing it down to the household level and incorporating that into considerations. Dr. Gladden, we know that this government, and Minister Habet mentioned it, has a targeted program for housing development, for infrastructure development, and drainage. How is it that these development projects are really implementing climate change considerations into their design, and how does that help us to build or climate change resilience?
Yes, thanks for that. When you look at infrastructure and climate-proofing infrastructure in the country, the direction that the country is taking right now is that most of these, what I consider large projects, they need to take into consideration that climate consideration, right? And this is not only a request from the funders, right? But also from the ministry itself, right? They are promoting, by and large, climate proofing, be it drainage, right? If they're constructing a highway, I recall the CRIP project, really wanted to build that resilient highway.
What is CRIP?
CRIP, that's a yeah, infrastructure project, right? So, but the only challenge that they faced was that the costing aspect of it, when you now take into consideration climate proofing a sector, especially for infrastructure, there's still that unknown, right? So in the initial formulation of projects that look at infrastructure, right, sometimes you start off with 20 million, and when in the middle of the process you realize, listen, I require an additional 10 million. How can you then go back to the fund and say, listen, we got the whole climate proofing aspect of it incorrect, right? Can we now request additional funds? There's not that flexibility, right? But the mindset of that entire sector when it comes to infrastructure and climate proofing the various infrastructure, they're taking it into consideration because they're moving beyond just simulating what happens if there's a flood event in the next 3 years. What happens if there's a flood event in the next 5 years? All of these things need to be taken into consideration because it might not be the frequency of the event, but the intensity of the event. These considerations are being embedded within these projects, right? And I'm just saying this for some of the more recent projects that I've come across, right? It is important that they're also take into consideration the social aspect because we do not build a road just to build a road's sake, right? We build a road for transportation, not only for the productive sector, and also there are communities along that highway or that roadway that needs to be taken into consideration. So there's a social component when it comes to the whole climate proofing aspect for this infrastructure project. It's beyond just the environmental consideration and the economical consideration. But in my experience, engaging with some of the technical personnel, yes, they are taking climate change extremely serious because we are just at the cusp. Other countries within the region, they're still finding that challenge to get that type of mentality when it comes to building that level of resiliency within the sector. And it is not only roadways. I recall an initiative with IDB and Belize Chamber of Commerce, whereby they're now looking at how do we climate-proof households, right? How do we now train our practitioners? Because in an assessment that was done within the private sector group, that was one of the challenge. Yes, we want to take this route, but finding the skill set, the know-how to conduct what we consider new innovations in technology, right? It is a challenge in Belize, right? So there's that capacity gap, and through this process, of course being supported by IDB, that initiative, it reached a lot of practitioners. So it is beyond helping them with I consider the physical change in how they conduct their business, but also it is more that emotional thing that they take into consideration. Listen, building a level of resiliency within these structures, it is important, right? Because at the end of the day, lives are at stake if it is not done right and if it's not done now. Because we understand that climate change, it has been an issue for us in the past and even more so going into the future.
I hear you saying that as we transition to these non-traditional sectors, there's a barrier in terms of costing and understanding the broad gamut of climate proofing some of these projects. There might be opportunities for collaboration, further collaboration with private sector in this process. And so I think, again, those are some of the key areas that we can look at when talking about NDC implementation. Moving to the left side of my panelists, Ms. Diane, you have been in this system for some time, and not necessarily old, right? I've just meant that very experienced, an expert here. And by nature of your work through UNDP, you've been engaging with these traditional and non-traditional sectors. What do you see are some of the national opportunities with respect to these traditional sectors and supporting NDC implementation, particularly through the UNDP support? And if maybe even looking at the community level, how is it that UNDP can support some of these community level projects? Because we often tend to look at the national level and don't consider the subsidiary or scale down of these projects.
I think the people on the left side are a little older than the people on the right side. But that said, Colin. but that said, when considering these so-called non-traditional sectors, particularly as we now move into the implementation phase of the NDCs, UNDP is looking not necessarily at the non-traditional sector, but a non-traditional approach to NDC implementation. This approach looks at energizing two primary vehicles. For us, the first vehicle is bringing local governments into NDC, bringing local government into NDC implementation. As you realize, our local governments are responsible for, or at least partially responsible for, the management of several sectors. This includes things that range from sustainable transport to also the local economic development and other things. And so bringing local government into NDC implementation essentially is following what in the Caribbean we say is the 1-1 cocoa full pot thing. Belize is true because of the hard work of the Ministry of Sustainable Development, has a very robust architecture for climate change management. And it is now time to localize those actions. And so what UNDP programming hopes to do as we move forward is to strengthen vertical coordination across governments and start to have local governments think about climate change as it relates to the government, the management of their municipalities and the development of their municipalities. So as these areas grow, they grow in a green way. Second to that is the greening of MSMEs. MSMEs provide the perfect opportunity for NDC localization. It is said that within Belize, I believe it's about, and Christopher, if I get it wrong, I'm sorry, but about 70% of all of our economic activities are tied into medium and small enterprises. The greening of our MSMEs, that is supporting them to take up new climate technology to build resilience within that, goes a long way in securing our people in terms of building resilience of our people, but also contributing to the raised ambition, the realization of the raised ambitions. There is measures that we hope to set in place that introduces greening modules within MSME development plans and strategies. The support of MSMEs to take on something as simple as replacing traditional energy sources within your MSMEs contributes again to that. There is a perfect opportunity within enterprises associated with our agricultural sector particularly, and the greening of value chains and processing. These things again contribute both to building resilience of the sector, which goes to the adaptation portions of our NDCs, but also contributes then to an open spaces where we can further raise our ambitions as it relates to the cutting down of greenhouse gas emissions. So, as I said, while we continue to support traditional sector as such, because the NDCs have a list and a very comprehensive list as it relates to those areas that can effectively contribute to building and the low carbon development pathway that the government of Belize is striving to achieve, and this whole idea of carbon neutrality. If we bring our local governments in and have our local governments work on carbon neutrality within their municipalities, again, it's the one cocoa full pots. As the actions, climate actions are taken up at the local level, those are the things that contribute to the overall national impact of what we want to see in terms of building resilient societies and meeting our obligations as a country in terms of the decrease of our emissions.
Thanks. I think, yeah, you outline some important areas that we could look at scaling down MSMEs across various sectors. And again, particularly because it's an important part of the whole recovery effort. So there are several opportunities now that presents itself going forward. Dr. Young, the 5Cs have been working across the Caribbean in supporting countries in developing projects that are focused in some of these both non-traditional and as well as traditional sectors and new industry, thinking about health, education, and some other core areas. Can you give us an idea of some of these projects and across the Caribbean that Center have been working with or partnering with, and what you see are some opportunities for Belize?
Thank you. Thank you, Kenrick, and Minister, may I say congratulations to Belize for being a global leader in SIDS, in launching its NDC implementation plan and its financing strategy. So I think is an absolute accomplishment from the government of Belize, and I think you should be proud of the document. I've looked at it. It's very comprehensive, as Diane indicated. But I want to start there because it's not a little bit of money. 1.3 billion US dollars, 3.4 billion Belize dollars with a B. And the question is, how do we finance it, right? And obviously we'll never get enough grants to be able to finance the implementation of the NDCs. And as a result, we need to bring in the private sector, and we need to think of how we incentivize the private sector to participate in this space. Traditionally, the private sector has not meddle too much in areas of both on the adaptation side of climate change, because adaptation by definition largely are considered public goods. So for example, if we're losing a beach in Placencia or in Hopkins or in Dangriga or in Monkey River, the question is who funds the intervention? Is it public money or is it going to be private money or a combination of both? It's harder to make the business case for the private sector in a public good, but not impossible. But on the mitigation side, it's relatively easy, because if I want to provide renewable energy to provide that power to a hospital, for example, that is very easy to be quantified. I know how much energy I'll produce from the PV system. I know the kilowatt per hour kilowatt costs. I can do my business case. I could make a case to the private sector to look at some investments. So I want to start, before I answer the question directly, to say that part of that challenge has been that the private sector is not used to dealing with the uncertainty that comes from not having the data in terms of what they're getting into. And so we are seeing now a basic question, and I see the governor of the central bank here used to be. He was here earlier, I'm not sure if he's still here. And the banking system in general, because if somebody comes to a bank today, for example, and want to build a resort in a coastal part of Belize or a part of the Caribbean, and the question is 20 years, and usually for those types of mortgages, you want to use the land and the assets, the building as collateral. The question is for the bank, is what is going to be the impact of sea level rise and coastal erosion on that property 20 years from now? And how do I factor that risk into my lending rates? And how does the insurance companies factor in that risk into their reinsurance? And so what you're now seeing is that this all of a sudden becomes a quite risky enterprise. And in the absence of data, the way the private sector deals with that is that they hike up the rates to try to cover for the uncertainty, and the insurance premiums are also very high. So part of what I think is required for the NDC implementation all over the Caribbean and the world is first starting to understand the climate risk and getting the climate data that is needed to then mitigate those risks. Now, obviously, you can't mitigate 100% of them, but you can mitigate enough where now the private sector becomes very interested. And how do we do that? We do that first by looking at de-risking investments using public money. Public money, I mean grants, I mean monies from the consolidated revenue. For example, we have a project in Grenada where we're using solar PV systems to provide renewable energy that powers a reverse osmosis plant to provide fresh water to a water-starved island in the Caribbean. So now what do you need for that is that we have done that. We've done it in 3 islands. We now have proven that the technology can work. We have looked at the regulatory environment in Grenada that required that to be enabled. One is a feed-in tariff. So if the private sector now invests in the renewable energy portion, and they could get a feed-in tariff that now the government utility purchases the power from that private sector generator of the energy, then it makes the investment a quicker payback period. The risks have now been minimized because we've already used the public sector money to minimize the risk. Climate change impacts everything, and health, education. So how do we climate-proof our hospitals, for example? And for what scenario? And for how much time? Because, right, so are we saying that if we're going to make our hospital system, our big hospitals, in some island states, it's just one hospital, how are we going to climate-proof them? What is going to be that cost? And under what scenarios? So in terms of the building codes, in terms of the amount of energy, in terms of all of these things. And also in schools. We had a project in the Bahamas where the daytime temperature is getting so hot that it's starting to impact the productivity of students in the classrooms. And so what we were able to do is to work with the government of the Bahamas to then install solar PV systems on the roof that were built to withstand up to a Category 3 hurricane. It's a completely smart classroom where now it is motion sensor and the ACs are run using solar PV. And again, if they produce more than what is required to run the school, the utility now pays the school for the excess energy. So that goes back to the enabling environment. Again, that the government would then create the enabling environment, like having the rules and the policies that the private sector can then rely upon with certainty, that if they were to do X, Y, and Z, that they would be able to recoup their investments. Also, in terms of non-traditional sectors and how we finance it, Belize, I think, has made global acclaim in terms of the recent Blue Bond and the scale of it. There's also debt for climate swaps that are mechanisms that countries can use to help finance the plan. And so there's also investment opportunities in what we call nature-based solutions. So these are things like we're dealing right now with coastal erosion. This is a major issue, not just in Belize, but across the region. And it's going to cost a lot of money to be able to build the kind of interventions, whether that's a seawall, whether it's restoration of beaches using mangroves and other soft interventions. The question now is, how do we make that into an investable, bankable project for which the private sector can come in. That requires a policy environment, but it also access to capital, right? So to access to money. And again, if we use the public money to de-risk the private sector investment, it makes the cost of that easier. And so we have to look at how to now provide the private sector with, Belize's NDC would have it. It outlines what is it that the government wants to accomplish over the period of time with a number of partners. It's now taking those specific, those broad areas and turning them into bankable projects that are de-risked to then invite the private sector to participate. So we have found that, and I think Minister Habet touched on it in his presentation, that the sweet spot, if there is such a thing in climate resilience, is when you look at projects that really have a nexus of other benefits. So you don't look at just a renewable energy project, but you look at how renewable energy can impact the water industry and how that can then impact your food security. And then you align these projects together. And so in each part of the project, you will have a renewable energy portion, so that's mitigation. But to the extent that that helps you withstand electrical shortages because of disasters, it's adaptation at the same time. And then it provides you with access to water, which then impacts your food security. And so we have to look at how do we then build these sweet spots by exploring how investment in one sector can then have spillover benefits to the other sectors, and the private sector can participate at various parts of that process. I'll end there for now.
Thanks very much, Dr. Young. I think some excellent interventions. I got the red flag like 3 times in the butt. So again, the idea here was just to whet the appetite and to start the conversation. We would like for this conversation to carry over in our little mixer after we concluded with the subsequent discussion. So I ask the audience to please join me in thanking the panelists for their intervention, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thank you to all the panelists once again for a fruitful and thought-provoking discussion. Mind the gap, incentivizing private sector participation in NDC implementation. That's the topic for the second panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists, CEO responsible for economic development in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Development and Investment, Dr. Osman Martinez, Chief Climate Change Officer, Dr. Lennox Gladden, President of the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Marcelo Blake, and finance expert in the Ministry of Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management, Christopher McGann. I call on CEO Dr. Williams to commence the discussion.
Thanks very much again, Ms. Courtney. And I think Dr. Young really opened some of the discussion with respect to private sector engagement. And as I've said in my first intervention, this is a discourse that we want. How do we get private sector engaged in supporting the building of climate resilience? He also mentioned the importance of government providing the enabling environment for that to happen. So we'd like to get some perspective again from the government as well as the private sector. We have Mr. Blake representing private sector actors. And then we have Mr. McGann, who is our biodiversity finance expert at the ministry. And I have him somewhere in between the public and private sector to give some opinions. So if we can start with Dr. Gladden on this side of the panel, back to this idea of the importance of the enabling environment, the enabling policy and legal environment. Can you speak to what are some of the key efforts ongoing in supporting the addressing of the policy gaps and that would support then enabling environment for private sector participation considering some of the interventions in our last panel by Dr. Young and other panelists?
Sure. And I'll start off by touching on what Dr. Young mentioned. When it comes to private sector investment and the creation of that enabling environment, within our national determined contribution, there are some specific targets, there are some specific priority areas. But this is not to say that if an investment under the climate change agenda is not clearly outlined within the NDC, it is not going to get any sort of support, because we realize that access is a challenge, but a prerequisite to actually, for resource mobilization for the respective sectors, is that it needs to have a level of alignment to our national development plans, right? Plans, strategies, policies, and for the sake of this discussion, our national determined contribution. That is a prerequisite, right? In the absence of that, it is going to be a challenge to access those opportunities, right? It's not impossible, but it's going to take a little bit longer to access those opportunities, because we're looking at specific activities to meet a certain target, right, under our climate change portfolio. So that in itself, and that was something that was highlighted, that it is a risk if that alignment does not take place, right? But it's not only focusing on the climate change agenda, because we do not divorce ourselves from the Sustainable Development Goals. We do not divorce ourselves from the Zendai framework that looks at disaster risk management. We do not. So that alignment needs to be there as a prerequisite for the private sector and by and large the public sector. In the absence of that, accessing funds, be it not only funds but technical support, right? The time, and sometimes given the environment in which we're in, right? Looking at the respective investment portfolio, you do not have that flexibility of wasting time, right? So the overall enabling environment and what we are promoting as a government and as a ministry is to help with that mainstreaming. Certain private sector entities, challenge that they're facing is, where do they go to? Who do they go to? Which organization do they go to if they want to bridge that gap, right? It is not something new per se. We have been trying to build resiliency, level of resiliency within the country of Belize for decades now. We've been doing a great job, right? It's just a name change at this point. So governance is important. We have that architecture in place. However, that level of collaboration between state and non-state actors to easily facilitate access, that is a hurdle that we're just trying to get over. I know the Ministry of Economic Development, right? They are making tremendous strides. That is part of they're targeting the private sector, and rightly so, because we cannot achieve our climate change objectives as a government on our own. Private sector, NGOs, civil society, they contribute a lot to resiliency building. So the enabling environment that we're looking at right now, apart from the governance structure, is imparting that knowledge to simplify access to some of the resources that are currently available to private sector. So we act as that matchmaking entity as well.
Thanks, Dr. Gladden. Chris, like I said, you're a hybrid in this discussion. Allow me first to read a quote from an article I was reading in preparing for this quick discourse, and I will ask your thoughts on that and then a follow-up question. He said that although private investors are increasingly concerned about the impacts of climate change on the value of their investment portfolios, they will require investment opportunities that are suitable size, that meet their risk-return hurdles, and offer adequate risk diversification and liquidity. This will require a pipeline of marketable projects, green financial instruments, and most importantly, complementary public finance. That's not from Dr. Young, although he said those almost exact same words, right? What are your thoughts on that? And the second part of my question is, what do you see are some of the opportunities for private sector investment in particular areas related climate actions, specifically when we look at opportunities for biodiversity investments?
Well, that's a hell of a quote, but very relevant to the discussion that has been happening and that needs to continue to happen. So, as many of my colleagues mentioned, we're a small developing state. I won't say island because we're not an island, right? And we bear significant burden of the challenge associated with climate change. And if we break that down to reality or what hits the common household or business, 2018, 2019, we had a severe drought. It affected agriculture and it affected energy production. The water levels got so low, we had to burn so much heavy fuel oil that it changed the generation mix and affected the profitability in energy. So your quote said something like structuring in investable projects. So I come from a previous hat I wore was managing risk, and I think just by the geographic location that we are exposed to climate variability and climate risks in all our traditional investments and financial assets associated or that fund these traditional assets. We're a tourism-driven economy. Tourism and agriculture are the drivers of the economy. And both industries are significantly affected by climate change and climate variability. We spend millions and millions on infrastructure, and not taking into account climate change and climate variability immediately puts your investments at risk. So I think it is imperative for allocators of capital, banks, other financial institutions, funds and different investment houses to look at climate when looking at their portfolio risks, especially here in Belize. And also, there's a prudent business case to be made for looking at how at least climate variation can affect your ability to produce goods and services. So I think structuring products that helps, structuring projects that helps, the enabling environment helps, but I think just as a prudent risk management tool in the private sector, we need to look at what we're doing and how the climate is affecting us and what we could do to, on the mitigation side, I guess, improve efficiency, and on the adaptation side to build better and a bit more resilient. I think that's my comment on the first question.
Yeah. And opportunities for investment in particular areas, biodiversity investments, and these sectors that we don't normally look at.
Sure. And again, that's another interesting opportunity. And to step back, like what is a protected area? It's a geographic area that we say we're limiting the way you access it and interact with it, right? And we do that because we believe at a macro level, at a national level, it's important. They contribute, what do they contribute to the average man? The literature calls them ecosystem services. What does that mean? Clean air, pollination, which contributes to food security, just a general pleasant environment. Those are the things that protected areas contribute. Shoreline protection, we were talking about erosion, that's important. And that comes at a cost. It costs to protect the areas. It costs to speak to the people in the communities that surround the protected areas and say, change the way you're interacting with this natural environment. And we need to figure out how to finance that. Part of the discussion that I thought we would hear more about in the NDC is carbon credits and how that could be a game changer in terms of inflows of funds to our country. And we have terrestrial carbon, I think, under the Red Plus, and we have blue carbon. That's the coastal environment that we're looking at. I think at a macro level, we could look at what portion of these inflows would actually accrue to protected areas, because What the private sector is looking for is certainty of cash flows. One of the most important lessons I got when I got into banking is that, you know, forget all this theory, all these fancy models. There's one question we have to answer, and that's tell me how we're going to get paid. And that's the biggest question that people in the private sector have. Yes, we want to invest, but we have to understand the potential cash flows. Another thing that we were looking at, and it's in the pipeline right now, is a concession framework. Again, private sector is looking for stability, answering the question, what the cash flows are going to be like, and can I invest in, and with a reasonable degree of certainty, other things being equal, expect to receive these cash flows. And the concession framework for protected areas tries to set out a framework that says, yes, I might be a protected area manager and my expertise might be in conservation work. I'm not necessarily an expert in running a business. So I will partner with someone from the private sector who could run a sustainable business if that's permitted within the protected area and actually generate some cash flows. And that's the direction that we want to head, because these protected areas are sequestering or assisting with carbon sequestration, and they are contributing to the climate change discussion. And I think those are some of the ways how we could begin the conversation of flows generated from protected areas and direct investments into protected areas.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Mr. Blake, first of all, allow me to congratulate you on being the now president of the BCCI, and thank you for joining the discussion. We've been talking about the private sector and their role, and you're wearing that hat now. Can you tell us a bit about some of the challenges faced by the private sector in contributing to this climate change agenda and making investments? We've heard a bit from different actors. We'd like to get some of your perspective and maybe even some cases if you have.
All right, thank you. Sorry. I'm happy to hear the discussion around the table, because I have advocates from Dr. Gladden, Dr. Young, in respect to support and the enabling environment that the private sector does need. But there are many challenges, obviously, and we've shared quite a number earlier. So I'll only pick on maybe 3 or 4 of them and kind of bring home some of the local examples. But the access and the sharing of information, we are data, well, we need to be more data-driven with our decisions, but that's really where the bottleneck is, because while there are studies and reports that have shown that there are works being done, at the end of the day, there's nothing that ties both together, private and public sector, where you could go to a standard location where all or most of that information would be readily available. And so the suggestion on that end is to look at revamping the marketing plan that you have and looking at how best you could possibly set up some type of centralized online portal that would allow for that data to be placed there and then to be able to share that with the private sector. And looking at those things that would specifically impact private sector in order for us to not necessarily have to sift through those things that may not be applicable to us any at all, because they're more public sector driven initiatives, all right? Our country and sector risks. At the end of the day, the country's rating and risks impacts the business sector because the access to funding becomes more difficult, right? And so in that area, it's important that we also work on improving our macroeconomics to enable the private sector to be better fit to support the government in some of those initiatives, but we have to improve our country in its ratings in general, because you do have some of the IFIs who may deal with or create arms that they can do direct grant funding or even do small loans to businesses. However, if in fact we are considered high risk, obviously then those funding options slowly dwindle and dry up. So working private sector, NGOs, social partners, looking at the framework, seeing how we can improve that in order to ensure that our macroeconomic future looks brighter. The domestic capacity constraints, I take that from 2 points, the domestic banks as well as access to finance. And they're not disjoint from each other. But in the case of the domestic banks, their hands are tied in many cases in looking at those complex financial tools that are necessary for private sector to actually access. You know, we've discussed where, you know, small business farmers their access to finances, or sorry, the banking system doesn't necessarily look at them favorably because they would have invested personal assets to get the farm going, but at the same time have to access loans to send their kids to school. Everything gets muddled together and there's no separation. And so when you go back now for financing for your business needs, you don't necessarily have that freedom to select. And then, of course, the access to finance continues to be a dominant issue with the investment climate. At the end of the day, the provision of equity capital is something that needs to be looked at. You know, looking at a domestic stock exchange, I know that's been a conversation ongoing for far too long. But also there are the low-hanging fruits. There's already the collateral registry and the what's the other bill that the central bank had been working on for access to finance for small businesses. At the end of the day, those are critical elements that if we put those in place and it allows for small businesses to access funds, then definitely there's room for us to now start looking at how we then create that resilience within our businesses and making that investment and shift towards climate resilience, right? And the last one is scaling, the scaling issues. So our size obviously plays against us as always, but that doesn't need to be a deterrent for us to look at the investments. The lack of diversification and our market concentration in the key sectors, banking included, are significant impediments. We are very heavy in certain sectors, when in fact there's so many others that we can venture into. But at the end of the day, comes back to the point made earlier in respect to a level of predictability and comfort for private sector to say, if I invest, there's going to be a certain level of return that will come back to my business. So looking at that, like I said, the low-hanging fruits, improving the access to information for the domestic investors, improving access to credit, and then, of course, definitely technical support, because this is greenfield. This is a new era for a lot of small businesses, a lot of medium-sized businesses, and for us to embrace it, we need the guidance and the support from a technical standpoint.
Excellent, thanks. Thanks for that. I think you gave us a nice little synopsis there of what are some key areas that government can focus on in supporting that enabling environment. Colleague and good friend, Dr. Martinez, you are at the Ministry of Economic Development, and I know that the ministry is looking at some efforts to support the private sector in accessing finance. Can you speak to some of the efforts that your ministry is looking at, and maybe even some approaches as it relates to the challenges outlined earlier?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Williams, and congratulations to your new appointment as well. Before I answer that question, I want to highlight that there has been a disconnection between government and the private sector. There is also, the government had failed, not now, but in the past, failed to understand that the private sector is the one who will drive economic growth. It's not the government. Governments are not entrepreneurs. Okay, governments are there to put policies. So when we come up with new policies, it gives me two questions. The first question is, are we enabling a friendly environment for the private sector? Or are we making, and the second question is, are we making things more complicated for the private sector? It is important to note that in 2010, the ease of doing business in Belize was at 98. We ranked 98 in the world out of 172 countries. And by 2020, we rank 135. When we look and we do some analysis on the FDI, foreign direct investments, continues to decrease, which is not good because we need the private sector to invest. Okay? Hence the reason the Briceño administration, through Plan Belize, knowing that the Honorable Prime Minister comes from the private sector and he himself is a businessman, he have highlighted the importance for us to ease the way of how the private sector do business in Belize. Now, have we been able to do it? If you ask me, no, I'm not satisfied. A lot of investors come to Belize, and their biggest concern is they can't open a bank account. They have problem to buy a piece of land. They have problem to transfer monies into Belize. So when you look at where we rank according to IMF, we are actually competing for investors along with Syria, Iran, Madagascar, Mozambique. I mean, this is where we are. This is the reality. And it needs to change. And the government have a huge responsibility on that part. So one of the biggest problems that I have heard from the private sector is the access to finance. Okay? But access to finance in general, but when I did some deep analysis, it's not only access to finance, but it's access of low-cost finance with a longer duration of payment. Because right now you will ask an entrepreneur, for example, if he goes to a bank, he will get funds, but he will need to start to pay back on 30 days after he accesses his funds, and then he must pay the full loan within a period of 5 years, the most, sometimes 7. So is this really helping our entrepreneurs and the private sector? And we also have to note that Belize, when we look at the MSMEs and we look at how many enterprises really fall within the MSMEs and what percentage are large enterprises, 93% fall within the MSMEs, and only 7% are large enterprises. And the government policies are aligned only to the 7%, incentive packages to the 7%. And that have to change. What about the 93%? The 93% contribute 75% of Belize's GDP. The good news is I am working on a policy to alleviate the 93% within the MSMEs. In terms of access into finance and low-cost finance, we have to take advantage of the NDC through the Green Climate Fund. So we are in the process of accrediting DFC. Why? Because then I will be able to get a concessionary loans at 0.01%, whereby we can pass on these loans to the private sector at a lower rate, 3%, 4% interest, and to have a longer duration of time to pay back. Should the private sector have a grace period to pay back? They should. Should have at least 2-3 years. You cannot start a business, especially if you're a startup, and know after the pandemic you need to refinance. So if you are going to refinance, you need cash. You need the flow of cash. The inflow of cash will be very important. But if you are paying everything to your loan, then you won't have any opportunity of growth. But the most important thing is access to finance, and I have recommended in one of the proposals, let's find incentives for the young entrepreneurs also and startup, that for every job that they are creating, that there should be an incentive. So I will end, Dr. Williams, by saying that we are serious when it comes in terms of helping the private sector, because we understand the role of the private sector, and the private sector is the only one who will help us to move forward. Through DFC, we have allocated from the Central Bank of Belize $40 million to help refinance the private sector. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doc. I certainly look forward to have some further discussion with you over a cold glass of something about those policies that you're developing. Unfortunately, I've gotten the red flag again. That means that our time is up. This discussion is healthy. We want to encourage you then to join us at the social and have further discussion. Again, all we wanted to do was to whet the appetite, start having this discussion, and let's see how together we can start to collaborate, move from discourse to action. And I think there are several opportunities that exist here for the public and private sector to start bridging this gap, which is why we chose the unique term, mind the gap. Let's start bridging the gap and do this in the context of building a more resilient Belize. Thank you very much, and I ask you to also give a round of applause to our panelists for sharing with us.
Thanks again to all the panelists for a stimulating discussion. We have come to the end of the program. It was such a pleasure to be here. We want to thank you all, the in-person guests, as well as our virtual audience. I call on finance expert, Mr. Christopher McGann, to deliver the closing remarks. After the closing remarks, be sure to make your way downstairs to the Palm Court area for the mixer. Thanks. Have a fantastic evening.
Thank you. Never did like that term expert, because I feel like I learn something new every day. So, protocol having been established, I'll just say good afternoon again, and start by thanking the Ministry of Sustainable Development, and in particular, the National Climate Change Office, for their tireless efforts in the development of Belize's NDCs, and all the stakeholders that helped too, and their efforts to promote the start of the implementation conversation with such a wide cross-section of entities. Belize's nationally determined contributions represent an ambitious yet reasonable suite of goals that will help us to meet our commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions under the Paris Agreement. Climate change and climate variability is an ever-present phenomenon that affects the production and consumption patterns of households and businesses. As pointed out by many of my colleagues here today and in the panel discussion earlier, as a developing country, unfortunately, we bear a significant cost associated with climate change and climate variability. In addition to the economic fallout associated with the pandemic, we have delayed projects, increased costs, we have shifts in employment patterns, and we've permanently changed what used to be business as usual. We've all had to make adjustments. We've all had to make adjustments in the wake of the pandemic. And I think the adjustments that we've made are actually an opportunity for us to grow and to develop, not for want of an overused term, greater resiliency. It's also an opportunity for us to work more with the private sector to achieve these bold and ambitious goals. Some of the NDC's thematic areas that we look at include coastal zone and marine resources, and also land use change. And what we're looking at generally is how do we sustainably manage and where necessary restore these environments and ecosystems. We look at agriculture. How do we reduce emissions and improve sustainability in our agriculture and agro-processing? Tourism has been a significant contributor to GDP and employment. How do we look at things like energy efficiency and coastal community adaptation to climate change as a part of this NDC conversation? And finally, energy. Currently, we source maybe between 30 to 40% of our energy generation through renewable energy with cogeneration and hydroelectricity. And the NDCs call for more utility scale solar to come on stream. I think the conversation is how do we get to a stable and sustainable energy mix and possibly look at where we could go with things like distributed generation and stabilizing the grid as we continue to grow. With that, I want to say thank you for attending. I think that this is the start of an excellent conversation that I look forward to continuing with you over a cold one, as the CEO had mentioned. So thank you again.